Hello, this is Ukr TV, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev, from Ukraine. And our guest today is Lawrence Freedman. He is a British academic, historian, and author specializing in foreign policy, international relations, and strategy. And he is professor of war studies in King's College, London. Professor Freedman, hello, and thank you so much to be with us today.
Pleasure to be with you.
Professor, war in Ukraine lasted a year and a half, and it is a good reason to make, some conclusions and maybe some evidence from all this long and hard process. And let me start from the very simple question: where we are right now, where Ukraine is, where Russia is, where our Western partners is, and even where countries of global south are.
Well, they're all watching. So where are we? I think where we are is that it's been a long, grueling war already, and it's going to carry on being grueling. We don't know how long this will go on for. I mean, to me, the basic conundrum for anybody trying to watch this war is that it was started by Russia. It stated objectives. None of its objectives, however you interpret them, are close to being achieved. That includes regime change, it includes security, and it includes territorial objectives, although obviously they still hold quite a bit of Ukrainian territory. And so the war ends when Russia accepts that it's not going to achieve its objectives. But the difficulty is that for Putin, acknowledging that would be to acknowledge failure. And then there would be a reckoning about why this war was launched in the first place. So I think one of the many tragedies of this war is that Russia does not know how to get out of it. I think if Ukraine wanted to get out of it, we know what Ukraine would have to do. It's not going to do it because it would mean handing over occupied territory. But Russia doesn't know how to end this, and I think so. That's the starting point. Though it's not achieving any of its major objectives, and its own offensives have done badly. I think the second thing to note, which obviously you're all aware of, is that Ukraine launched its own offensive in June. It didn't go as people hoped. I suspect now it's accepted that there were some unrealistic assumptions about how possible it would be to break through some pretty elaborate, extensive Russian lines, but pretty quickly they changed strategy and I think accepted that Ukraine would have to fight in a different sort of way, not dramatic, bold breakthroughs, but chipping away at Russian strength, using its better artillery to take out Russian artillery. And man, we're now seeing at the moment some significant Ukrainian gains. How significant they'll be, not yet clear. And of course, there's only a month and a half or so more probably of fighting at this intensity. Although, I don't think we should necessarily assume that everything packs up for the winter. I think the Allies, including the UK, even before the start of the offensive, had understood that this was likely to go on for some time, or at very least they had to show that they were prepared for it to go on for some time. And I think that's now where we are. The stepping up ammunition production. The British have been saying some quite interesting things about the extent to which the way that the offensive has gone means that there aren't really major shortages of the sort of equipment that was being brought in earlier in the year. Some tanks have been destroyed and so on. But the main need is just to keep the basics of war coming in. And perhaps, eventually the F-16s will come and so on. But I think the mindset now is to accept that whether or not this is a long war, unless we show that we can help Ukraine sustain it, and Ukraine is prepared to sustain it, then Ukraine will just get into more difficulty. I think the final thing you mentioned is sort of the global South, which is in fact a lot of different countries. I think there's a lot of things going on there. They want the war to be over. They find it costly, disruptive, grain, oil, and so on. Interestingly, all the various peace initiatives, none of which have come to very much, whether China or Saudis or South Africa or even Brazil, they all, in the end, get caught on the Charter of the United Nations and the inadmissibility of Russia annexing territory by means of force. And as Putin isn't prepared to acknowledge that he's done anything wrong there, their peace initiatives don't get very far. But I think it adds to some distance and irritation with Russia, without wishing to exaggerate what that will mean in practice. So I think we're at a rather frustrating stage that we'll soon be back into winter. There's going to be more challenges, I think, to Ukraine in terms of whether the Russians return to attack your electricity systems and so on. On the other hand, Russia is now having its own experience of drones coming in from all directions in unexpected places, the position in Crimea being made more and more difficult. And I think all of these things, will wear away over time. So it's a question of patience, and I think always to keep in mind, always to emphasize that this is not a war Russia is winning.
Professor, let's try to speak a little bit deeper about our counteroffensive and about situation around the Ukrainian counteroffensive, because I think it is a little bit different situation, because one happens on the ground, next happens, in media, in international organization, in center for analysis of different situation in different universities. I think it is a little bit different situation. What is your understanding of Ukrainian counteroffensive, and again, situation around this counteroffensive?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's clear that if Ukraine wants its territory back, it has to liberate it. So that's the starting point. So, and then there are a number of strategic issues about how you go about it. So, as you'll be aware, there's one issue about whether to concentrate on the south or divide your efforts between the south and the east. And there's good arguments on both sides. The argument for concentrating on the south is the bigger strategic gains are going to be found there. You can potentially get to the sea, cut the Russian forces in two, but it's for that very same reason, it's incredibly well defended. The argument for going for the east is politically, it's really probably as important to the Russians. It's the Donbass, what they claim they're after, and it's the Russian defenses aren't as extensive there, but it's still pretty grueling fighting, and you don't quite have the best equipment in the east either. So my sense is that you can't abandon the east because it's important to the Russians, because the Russians have got a lot of forces there, and you want to tie up those forces. But my sense is that the Ukrainian forces are a bit more tentative in the east. and now feel they've got the basis of a breakthrough in the south. Again, it's I think one of the things we've all learned to be careful about is anticipating gains that have yet to be made. But certainly after a difficult period, the news has got better over the last few weeks. I think one of the problems which has been highlighted, and I think this became particularly thrown into relief when we saw those sort of anonymous criticisms from the Pentagon and so on, is there was a degree of unreality, I think, in some Western expectations of how a war like this could be conducted. I mean, we've seen, from day one that the defense is stronger than the offense. So the attackers have got lots of problems to get through, and Ukraine would clearly face those problems. As soon as forces are in the open, they're vulnerable. You have the minefields and so on. So, Ukraine has gone back to basically dismounted infantry picking their way through minefields, while some pretty good artillery, which they have now, is battering away at Russian artillery. And the more you can take out the Russian artillery, and the further you can get beyond the main minefields, the more hope there is. But it's difficult, I fear in April, May, there was a bit too much excitement about what this offensive could achieve. And there were rather belated attempts to dampen down the excitement, because I think many of us looking from outside were always cautious, because it's very difficult. I mean, it's not a failure on Ukraine's part. It's just difficult. But it's having shifted tactics and adapted, it's going better.
Professor, do you think that Russia is ready for a long war?
They want us to believe they're ready for a long war. I think Putin, as I said before, isn't really sure how to bring this war to an end. So what he's done is shut down all opposition, both from the left, who didn't like the war itself, and from the right, who didn't think it was being prosecuted properly. He's kept loyalists in position, and he'll bring more people into the fight if necessary. I think the two issues that, in addition to the ability of Ukraine to sustain its operations and hold tight while it's being attacked in terrible ways, it's still being attacked. The two big issues for Russia: the first, the effect on opinion of what may seem to them rather random drone strikes. Ukraine has put a lot of effort into its air defenses. I mean, they're still not perfect, but they're pretty good now. Some areas are better protected than others. Russia hasn't put that effort in. And it's obviously a much larger country. It's got many more assets to defend. It hasn't really thought about dispersion and concealment as the Ukrainians had to think about it. So although they're not being attacked by airstrikes, the drones are a bother. I think they're more than an inconvenience. So that, I think, will erode public confidence. It's not going to collapse confidence, but it'll erode it. And then there's the question of the economy, of the Russian economy. Now, at the moment, the economy, if anything, is overheating because so much is being spent on defense production and so on. There's labor shortages as a result because people have left, because people are at the front, and there's not enough left for the factories. So all of this is adding to inflation. That puts pressure on the ruble. That leads to interest rates having to go up. That leads to a weaker standard of living and real economic problems. Whether this is something that's unmanageable for the Russians, I doubt. I think they'll cope. And it has to be said, the Russian economic management has been quite effective, but it's putting more and more strain on the managers, and I don't think it'll be a sudden sort of falling off the cliff edge with the Russian economy, but they've clearly got problems. So you have to assume that though they wish it to believe that they can keep on going, at least till the start of 2025, when they'll hope for a different American president, it's not that easy. And if there are serious military breakthroughs, and remember, we've got, before the American presidential election, we've got another whole year of fighting, that if Ukraine is able to build on its recent successes, it could create a crisis for Russia. I mean, that's what one has to hope. But none of these things are certain. But that's the path to victory. We keep on coming back to the fact the path to victory for Ukraine runs through Moscow, not in taking Moscow, but in persuading those amongst the Russian elite that in the end this is a losing game.
Professor, I read you constantly, and I know that you often look to the situation around the Russians' war against Ukraine much more broader. And if it is possible, let's discuss some a little broader things. Because on your last article, you wrote that many politicians in USA say that it is possible that war again among China and USA is possible. Many politicians in USA say so. Do you really think that Chinese attack on Taiwan is possible? Do you think that the war among USA and Chinese is possible? And it is important because you say about the strong connection among situation in Pacific Ocean and situation in Ukraine.
So it's possible. I mean, you can't rule it out. And one can imagine circumstances in which it would take place, which I think are unlikely, because it would require really the Taiwanese to take an enormous gamble and almost invite a war. And if they appear to be doing that, they couldn't actually be that sure of American support. But it's not, and I wouldn't suggest it was unreasonable for Americans to worry about Pacific contingencies. They may happen. But I think at the moment it's rather speculative. But the American military, I think in many ways, see it as their main priority to prepare for a war with China. It's largely maritime, not solely, but largely maritime in air and space and so on. And therefore, it doesn't affect as much as it might do the preparations or the support being given to Ukraine, which is largely land. And that's why people normally say the cost of the war to the US is about 5% of its defense budget. It's manageable. So in my last Substack, what I was arguing about was the idea that because there's a chance at some point the US might find itself in a conflict with China, therefore it must conserve everything that might be necessary for that and hope somebody else looks after Ukraine, mainly the Europeans. And that just seemed to me irresponsible. I don't, I think one might wish the Biden administration did more, but it's really done quite a lot for Ukraine. It's kept with the Europeans, it's kept Ukraine in the fight, and doing well. I mean, obviously, Ukraine is taking the bulk of the pain and punishment, but the US hasn't done a bad job, and it seems to me utterly pointless to think of this as a good moment to decide that the US has had enough and must prepare for a war which may never happen with China. And I think it was one of the consequences of some of the adverse press commentary in the States of a few weeks ago about things not going as quickly as they should and so on. I think that encouraged this group to think, well, we don't want to be caught up in a prolonged stalemate, so let's cut our losses and run. Or else those who believe Ukraine can't win, it's bound to be a stalemate, therefore we should have negotiations. But there's nothing, Russia has shown no interest in negotiations. We'll know Russia's in trouble when it talks about negotiations, but at the moment it's waiting for the West and Ukraine to take the initiative. And I just don't think that's possible.
Professor, Britain always was the first country who helped Ukraine, and it is very important for us. Do you think that Britain will continue support Ukraine in any situation? I mean, change of president in USA or change some, policy in European Union and others?
Look, there's always a possibility of major political change, and probably most in the US than elsewhere, though I'd still be surprised if Trump became president. Certainly can't be precluded. In the UK, I don't think there's going to be much change of policy. There's a new Ben Wallace, who obviously Ukrainians know well, has retired. His replacement, Grant Shapps, not as experienced, but insists we're following the same policy. The Labour Party, the opposition party, supports the policy. You don't see any difference between the positions of the government and the opposition. I think, for most people in the UK, very sympathetic to Ukraine. You see Ukrainian flags flying everywhere. They want Ukraine to succeed. And it's not really a controversial issue in British politics. We've got lots of controversial issues in British politics at the moment, but support for Ukraine isn't one of them.
Professor, at the beginning of our interview, we mentioned Global South. And let's back a little bit for that theme, because it is a very interesting situation that many countries, or leaders of many countries of Global South, are interested to be involved in this process of negotiation. And it is very interesting why it's happened. Does they think that this negotiation will be so successful that gives them, glory for the end of the war? Or why? What's happened? What does it mean? It is very interesting.
Yeah, I think the difficulty with talking about the Global South is that there's lots of different countries there, all of them, or many of them, very big, bigger than your country and bigger than mine. So you've got Brazil, you've got South Africa, you've got India, you've got China. Secondly, they don't agree on everything. China and India are in a very poor state in their bilateral relations at the moment because Russia claims a chunk of Chinese territory. So it's not a homogenous group. Secondly, and they're divided amongst each other. Secondly, I think it's easy enough to understand why they think they can play a peace role. First, although they haven't come out in support of Russian aggression, and a number of them have voted against it in General Assembly votes and so on, they don't want to be seen to be on NATO's side. I think there's a lot of residual irritation with the West because of Iraq in particular, that we have double standards, that we're in no position to talk about invading countries where you're not welcome, and so on. So they have some distance from the Western position, and they still talk to the Russians, even if President Putin has to be on a Zoom screen. the war it hurts them. I mean, the grain problems with ending the grain initiative that Putin did recently, the high energy costs, and all of this affects these countries. And they have a sort of a general view that you find every time somebody else is in a war that it all seems a very silly thing to be doing and you should stop. And all it needs is people of goodwill to come forward and find a way to stop it. And we know it doesn't work like that. And then I think finally the key thing was in February when China came forward with its own peace plan, and most of what other countries have proposed are variations on what the Chinese proposed. Now, the Chinese rhetoric wasn't particularly helpful, blaming NATO for fueling the conflict with arms sales and so on. But actually, if you look at the detail of the detail of the Chinese proposals, they weren't that bad. I mean, they would require far more of Russia than they would of Ukraine because it would accept the principle of territorial integrity, accepted international humanitarian law. And I think to his credit, President Zelensky saw that, I think, quicker than many in the West saw that. And hence his own conversation with Xi and trying to improve relations with China. So all of the proposals coming forward are variations on that, and they're not particularly harmful to Ukraine. I think I think you can say they're unrealistic for the reasons we've discussed, that Putin has not got a lot of interest in implementing them. But the proposals themselves, if the principles were followed, are not bad. But so far they're not getting very far. I think there is a value in them, in that if at some point Russia wants a way out, they're not going to talk to Washington or London or Berlin or whatever. They're more likely to talk to Beijing or Delhi or Saudi Arabia. And it doesn't do any harm if those countries have set out positions which will actually limit what the Russians can expect. So I don't have any problem at all with these proposals coming forward. I just don't expect them to lead to very much at the moment.
Professor, in one of your articles, you wrote, let me quote it, please, if it is possible. The Russian-Ukrainian war is primarily about territory. This is what game theorists call a zero-sum game. If one wins, the rest must lose. The feature of war explains why it is so difficult to achieve any outcome through negotiation, why ongoing battles are so important, and why those who comment on the war begin to spending so much time studying maps. US, the best in strategy. And let me ask you about the possible scenario of continue of this war. What do you think about it?
Well, how long if the war just goes on?
How long? What is possible? What can be done?
I think my assumption from as soon as we were through the 24th of February, 2022, and the Ukrainians were fighting, my assumption was they would continue to fight. Now, even those who thought the Russians would have a much easier time then also thought the Ukrainians would continue to fight one way or the other. And that remains my view. I don't see any situation in which, I can imagine circumstances in which there's a pause in the fighting or some agreement on some arrangements to test opinion eventually in the Donbass. There are possibilities. One should never rule these things out. But basically, the Ukrainian position will continue to be that the borders of 1991 are Ukraine's borders, and that's what they should be. Now, if it was the case that Russia was pressing hard for a deal, Ukraine would come under pressure. They'd be encouraged to look at it, to come up with counter proposals, to at least talk and so on. But the Russians haven't done that, and for a variety of reasons, because I don't think Putin quite knows how to make the concessions that would be required. He'd have to admit that this didn't really go according to plan, that Zelensky would stay in power, that Ukraine would not be demilitarized, that it might join NATO, all sorts of things that he'd rather not admit. But if the Russians did start to make proposals, then however much the Ukrainians might resent them, they might still have to take notice. But I don't see those proposals coming along. So I think at the moment, what we're doing is demonstrating that Ukraine can continue to fight, can stay in the war, can continue to hurt Russia, Russian troops, and slowly but surely take back territory. I mean, it's war. There may be setbacks. There may be a successful Russian attack somewhere in the east or whatever. So you can't predict exactly how it'll turn out, but you're going to see more of what we're seeing at the moment. I mean, it's reached a stage that you can imagine continuing like this for some time. So what I'm looking for always is not only are Ukrainian forces able to break through, but is it the case that this is putting strain on Russian politics, on the Russian elite? I think it is, but not enough yet to cause a major shift. And I think if a shift ever comes, it'll first be a proposal for talk. And I can't see the Russians having many other options if they think the war is going badly. I've never taken the nuclear threat. I mean, you have to take it seriously, but I've never thought it was a reasonable option for Russia. So they'll carry on doing the sort of things they've already done, attacking civilians, attacking infrastructure, pushing where they can. But they've depleted their forces quite a lot. They can still find more manpower, but not trained, experienced, professional manpower. And a lot of their kit has been destroyed, and it can be, you can step up production, but there's an awful lot of ground to make up. So I basically expect more of the same. And at some point, it wouldn't surprise me, but we haven't had it yet, if you start to see some feelers going out from Moscow, maybe through to Beijing, indicating that they're interested in trying to do a deal. That may not stop it, but I mean, that would be the next thing I'd be looking for.
And Professor, last question. Let me address the question of our audience to you. We are here in Ukraine worried that as war continue, more and more countries involved in this process, not directly, but indirectly. And we're really worried that this big global change that's started all over the world, or maybe continue all over the world, will create situation when Ukraine will be in between, West and, I don't know, global South or East. And it will be constantly long war, which is not just about Russia and Ukraine, but maybe much, much broader.
It is. And a lot of people watch very closely for signs of, Ukraine fatigue or whatever. It hasn't happened yet. And I think actually the level of support at the moment is manageable, and it's being stepped up. The EU has just released its orders for more artillery production. US is stepping up artillery production. And these are the basics that Ukraine needs. So I think if it was perceived that Ukraine was losing, or if it was perceived that Ukraine was rejecting a reasonable Russian proposal, then it may change. But at the moment, I think it's part of the European consensus. There are some countries, Hungary, maybe soon Slovakia, where there may be dissent, but by and large, that's where we are. And we went through all of this talk a year ago about how Western support would fall away, and it hasn't as yet. There's a question of affordability and practicality and so on. Those issues are going to be there. But in principle, I don't see any big shift.
Professor, thank you so much to be with us today. Thank you.
My pleasure. Good luck.
Thank you.